Some of you have asked what the schedule is going to be in terms of teaching between Bill and I. Since we've combined our classes, we have the wonderful opportunity to have two teachers instead of just one of us plugging along all the time, which Bill and I really like. So we do not have a teacher for this class. We have two of us carrying the load. So what we are doing is we are dividing the year into 8 parts. That's 6-week segments. And so every 6 weeks, one of us is responsible for those 6 weeks. Now that doesn't mean we will teach those 6 weeks. It just means we're responsible for them. One of those 6-week segments, I'm actually going to be gone all of it, Bill. You don't know it yet. So I'm going to say Bill will be teaching all of that, I hope. And even though I'm responsible for that 6 weeks. So so we've broken the year into basically 1.5 month segments. 8 of those. So every 6 weeks roughly, the other person will be responsible for the teaching load. It doesn't mean they will teach necessarily, but it will be their responsibility to either teach or to arrange with somebody to take care of the teaching. So in that respect, there are 2 of us responsible for the teaching, and our responsibility rotates every month and a half. So that's how it works. So mid-February, Bill is the captain, and I will sit along the shore or in the back row or right there and watch him as he pilots the ship. So that's how we're going to work it. Any questions? Good, because I don't have any answers beyond that. Please turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 1. Second Samuel chapter 4, verse 1. When Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Who are the players? Well, in this verse, Ishbosheth is the king of the north, and Abner was his general. So, who's Israel? Israel are the northern 11 tribes. In the south we have Judah, ruled by David. In the north we have Israel, the 11 tribes that broke away. Formerly we had 12 tribes ruled by Saul. Saul was killed on the battle. David had been running away from Saul, so much so that he was afraid for his life. He went down into Philistine lands. When Saul was killed, David returned, came back into his home tribe of Judah, which was in the south. They crowned him king. The northern tribes, the 11 tribes, said, Abner, what are we going to do? Abner said, well, we've got a son of Saul that's left. We're going to make him the king. And so for 5.5 years they struggled at that, and eventually they made him king. So we have this scenario where you've got a divided kingdom. Well, when Ishbosheth heard that Abner, the guy who had kind of put this whole kingdom together, had died, he became afraid. And suddenly he decided he couldn't rule anymore. And when that happened, he lost courage. And when he lost courage, all of Israel became alarmed. Why? Because suddenly they are afraid that there's nobody to protect them. So you're relying on your king to be strong and to protect you from your enemies, namely the Philistines and from Judah, the king David and the people from the south. What's been happening for 7 years is God has been blessing David's kingdom of Judah, and they're becoming stronger and stronger, and Israel is becoming weaker and weaker. And so the reason for this whole breakdown had been that Abner had decided to, well, let me not jump ahead. So what had happened was Abner had made Ishbosheth, Saul's son, the king of the north, because essentially he wanted to maintain his finger on power. If he had just backed away when Saul had died, what would have happened? Well, David would have come in, become king of all of it, and David had his own general, and so Abner would have become nobody, or he would have been a servant of David's general. So Abner, being a power-hungry kind of guy, wanted to stay in charge. And so he had said, well, I've got Saul's son here, let's make Israel its own kingdom, and that way I can still be the head guy. And so he was kind of like the man holding the strings, and Ishbosheth was kind of like the puppet. Well, after 7 years, Abner decided, you know what, I'm tired of holding the strings. I want to be the guy in charge out in front. And so Abner decided to start nibbling at taking the kingship himself by taking over one of Saul's concubines, which is how you did it in those days. That was kind of your secret way of saying, I want to be king. You take over one of Saul's concubines. And Ishbosheth said, I know what you're doing. They had a big fight. Abner says, hey, I hold the powers to the kingdom. I'm going to go over to David. I'm going to offer a treaty, and I'm going to show you, Ishbosheth, that I really have the true power behind the throne. And it turns out when Abner does this and stomps out and goes over to David, the reality is things start unraveling for Ishbosheth. So kind of a long history lesson here, but if you don't really understand what's going on, it doesn't make a lot of sense what happens when you jump into this passage. So a little bit of an intro here to kind of get us going. So what you've got really going on here was that Abner had been making a power play because he wants to make sure that he's the guy in charge, whatever happens, whichever way this goes. So when he goes back to David and says, I want to broker a deal and bring Israel back into the fold, what he's really saying is, provided you'll make me the general in charge of it all, because otherwise there's no deal here. And Abner almost succeeded. The tribes, it turns out, he went back and he was having some success signing the treaty. And everything looked like it was going to work out. There was going to be a treaty signed with Abner and David. And we talked about this a little bit last week. The only problem was when he went back to David's territory to finalize the plan over in Hebron, everything was interrupted. It was all interrupted by an untimely death, his, when Joab showed up, the general of the southern army, and murdered him. And suddenly everything was in an uproar. And now Ishbosheth, when he hears the news, realizes that things have come apart, and suddenly he doesn't have Abner there as his backup, because really the people of Israel were trusting in Abner. They knew Abner. They really didn't know Ishbosheth. He had been sort of this fourth son of Saul that really nobody knew about until after the battle, and suddenly Abner elevates this son that had sort of until now been in obscurity. And so with Abner gone, Israel is pretty nervous. So let's go on to verse 2. Now Saul's son, and I want you to know that right there, the disrespect of this passage. He's not Ishbosheth, he's Saul's son. He's not even now Israel's king. doesn't even call him that. It just says, now, Saul's son had two men who were leaders of raiding bands. One was named Benah, and the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon of Beeroth from the tribe of Benjamin. Beeroth is considered part of Benjamin because the people of Beeroth fled to Gittim and have resided there as foreigners to these days. So this is two men who have become members of the tribe of Benjamin because of some fighting that had been going on from their tribe. They'd fled to Benjamin, had sort of become foreigners who had been folded into the tribe of Benjamin. It's really not important to our story. They are really Benjamites. Why is important to the story that they're Benjamites? Well, normally when you're a king, what you do is you appoint people to points of leadership who are from your tribe, because that way you know when there's a problem, they're going to stand with you. So Ishbosheth has two people from his tribe, his homeboys. He figures he's safe. They're Benjamites. So this passage is showing you that even his homeboys are against him. The Benjamites are about to do him in. Nobody is safe because his stock has gone right to the bottom. He's not even safe with his own tribe. Verse 4, Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. So you go, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about Ishbosheth. And suddenly we now have Jonathan, son of Saul, thrown in here. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. A servant girl picked him up and fled. But as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. Another one of those names that you want to pronounce many, many times back to back, right, Bill? It's one of those ones you look up to, Mephibosheth. Well, this son of Saul, or this son of Jonathan, who is the son of Saul, is the same Jonathan that was David's best friend. So you've got David and Jonathan, best friends, a son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth. He's the only son of Jonathan, and he's suddenly mentioned here. We learn that Jonathan has a young son. And at the news of Jonathan's death, someone in that household, a nursemaid, someone who's responsible for taking care of this, we believe to be about 5 years of age, because you go to later on when he's mentioned and you age backwards. And they grab him and try to get him out of the household to safety, because they are pretty certain, because this is generally what happened, is when a king is killed in battle and his sons are killed in battle, what the Philistines are going to do is they're going to go, we need to make sure no heir rises up and 10 years from now comes back and takes vengeance on us for killing off his pa and his grandpa. We're going to go down there and we're going to kill off all the heirs, right? So that they don't grow up and come back and kill us. So the servants are right. You got to grab the heir and any spares and get them out of Dodge. Well, unfortunately, when they grab the heir, Mephibosheth, they drop him, and he's lame. Well, why is he here in the story at this point? This passage is here because this passage isn't about Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. This passage is about succession. Who's going to be the heir now that Ishbosheth is dead? That's why this passage is here. They know that Ishbosheth is dead, Saul's son, and Ishbosheth, common knowledge among them, the readers of this passage, has no heirs. So he's evidently not married and has no children. So then they want to know, well, do any of Saul's offspring have any eligible children that could be heirs? Well, there is one. Mephibosheth. Oh, good. What happened to him? Well, he's lame. Well, how does that weigh into it? Well, a son of Jonathan would qualify, except he's paralyzed. And you wouldn't qualify a paralyzed person. Why? Because what was the role of a king? The role of a king was to lead the army into battle. Rolling a wheelchair down through battle is not a pretty sight. So that's just not going to work. So this passage is here for the sole reason of ruling out Mephibosheth as an heir eligible for taking over from Ishbosheth. That's why this passage is here. And once you establish that he's in fact paralyzed, you can forget about him as an heir to the king and you can move on. Okay, that one's moved off, that one's checked off. Oh, no more heirs. So we can move on. So we go on down now to, so he's kind of setting the stage for why the death of Ishbosheth is so important to the story, because what we're now going to see here is that when Ishbosheth gets murdered, there are no more offspring of Saul capable of becoming king. That's what the writer here wants to establish. There are no more. When Ishbosheth goes, Saul's household is done away with. So let's go to verse 5. Now Rechab and Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, set out for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah slipped away. They had gone into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom, and they stabbed and killed him. They cut off his head. Taking it with them, they traveled all night by way of the Arabah. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you period. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." Now the pivotal point the men are trying to make is this. Here is the head of Ishbosheth, and as we give this head to you, we are symbolically giving you Israel, because there are no more heirs. So with this head, we're giving you the title deed to Israel. That's what they're trying to say. They are also trying to justify their deed by tying Ishbosheth to Saul. Your enemy, they say, who tried to kill you. In other words, Ishbosheth didn't try to kill David, but Ishbosheth, son of Saul, who tried to kill you. So they're trying to make sort of an out-on-the-limb justification, which is not going to work with David, by the way. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. Kind of a, I don't know if anybody, an English teacher here, can parse that for me. It's not good English, I can tell you that. I know that much about English. Beyond that, that wasn't my major. What they did not understand, that the kinds of people that David saw as an enemy were people who profaned God like Goliath and were basically out to destroy God's people in a very overt way. Saul was not David's enemy in that way. And let me read you an example of who David saw Saul to be. Back in 1 Samuel 24, 9 to 10, this is an occasion that occurred right after David refused to kill Saul. He had an opportunity to spare him, and instead he cut off Saul's cloak. And then, this one just makes me chuckle. After he had cut off a part of his robe, David felt embarrassed and ashamed that he had even cut off part of Saul's robe. He was like, I can't believe I even did something to this robe. I shouldn't have even done that. And I'm going like, yep, that's David. So now Saul leaves that vulnerable position he's in the cave and goes back across this little valley, and now they have this conversation at a distance. And David shouted to Saul in 1 Samuel 24 verse 9, "Why do you listen to the people who say I'm trying to harm you? This very day you can see with your own eyes it isn't true. For the Lord placed you at my mercy back there in the cave. Some of my men told me to kill you, but I spared you. For I said, I will never harm the king. He is the Lord's anointed." David did not view Saul as his enemy. He viewed Saul as the Lord's anointed. So when these men are trying to convince David that Saul, your mortal enemy, should be equated to Ishbosheth, they didn't understand David, because David did not see Saul as his enemy, and therefore did not in that way see Ishbosheth as his enemy. So these men then assume that they are fulfilling the Lord's will. The Lord has avenged. You notice that phrase there. The Lord has avenged. Well, I know that they probably are just using the phrase of the day, because people tended to use lofty language when they were trying to get somebody to listen to them and believe them. However, we need to be careful because, it's a new year, so now you're reading from Genesis up through. And I've been struck by the fact that when fathers gave blessings to their sons, and then later on there was some deceit, and they found out that a younger one got the blessing instead of the older one, they couldn't undo it. There was power in what they said. Over and over, there was power in what they said. God seemed to really care about what was said. In little things, in very little ways, sometimes in ways that were not even formal, God really honored what was said. And I have to wonder when people say things like, "It was the Lord's will," or "the Lord has avenged my Lord the king against Saul." I'm just wondering how much evil in the world is done by those who wish to do something and box it up with "the Lord's will is," when they've never taken time to really discern what the Lord's will is. They just want to wrap up what they want to do with the Lord's will. And I'm wondering how much accountability, and maybe from some New Testament things that are said often about there are many who are not with you today because of something or this or that. I'm wondering if God doesn't hold us more accountable than we know. You know what I'm saying? Because we just box stuff up and think that, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. It's just a little slip of the tongue or whatever. And maybe God holds us more accountable than we know. I'm wondering if even today, maybe it's the ungodly or the non-Christian, or maybe it's the Christian who just thinks, well, I'll slip in a little of this or that because it makes me look good. But maybe we need to really be careful about how we slip in, well, God told me this or that, and he no more told you that than maybe it's just that I had a bad bowl of cereal and I'm saying God did that, We need to be careful about invoking God's name. I really wonder if foul acts draped in piety won't be judged. And this certainly qualified as a foul act draped in piety, in my opinion. And doesn't that, in fact, almost qualify in the truest sense as using the Lord's name in vain? I mean, we want to tie it to profanity, but when you invoke God's name to justify an evil act, isn't that really using the Lord's name in vain? We don't think of it that way, but I think that may qualify. Verse 9, David showed Rechab and his brother Benah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, or David answered, Rechab and his brother Benah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, as surely as the Lord lives. Now David is not using the name of the Lord in vain here. David really means what he is saying. As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble. When someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. I think an Amalekite comes to mind. This was the reward I gave him for his news. David is appalled, to put it mildly, that someone might think he would be pleased at the murder of Ishbosheth, who frankly is not guilty of trying to put David to death, unlike his father who was. And since his treatment of the Amalekite in Ziklag had been so decisive, there David had issued a death sentence for killing the Lord's anointed. I want you to notice here that Ishbosheth is not called the Lord's anointed by David. What is he called? He's called an innocent man. I think David is very careful not to call Ishbosheth the Lord's anointed, because he is not, in fact, the Lord's anointed in the way that David and Saul were. You know, Saul was the Lord's anointed because of the hardness of Israel's heart. God gave them what they wanted. And David was certainly the Lord's anointed because Samuel, under the call of the Lord, went and anointed David. And I mean, in a sense, he is appointed by God, because Scripture says that all leaders are anointed by God, whether they be good or be evil. So, you know, God's hand is on leadership. But I think when we use the word God's anointed, it's a very special term that applies in very special and specific ways, that goes above and beyond the phrase we see in Scripture about God being in charge of the fact that leaders around the world, both good and evil, are there by God for his purposes, which is a different subject that we will not try to tackle. So it goes on, verse 11, how much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you? And right now I hear somebody thinking, uh-oh, this didn't go the way we planned. David rules that Ishbosheth is an innocent man, and these two men, therefore, are not redeemers of the land. They are murderers, because they have killed an innocent man. They have shed the blood of a man who is not worthy of being murdered. When David calls Ishbosheth an innocent man, he specifically denies Ishbosheth the title of King of Israel. He's not going to allow him that title, because that is a title bestowed on Ishbosheth by Abner as a way of subverting what God had planned for Israel. Ishbosheth had no godly claim to the throne. Those were because of Abner's schemes. Verse 12, so David gave an order to his men, and they killed him. They killed them, They cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. So let me take that last part first. So they took the head of Ishbosheth and they honored it by burying it in the tomb where Abner had been honorably buried. Basically, they laid the head of Ishbosheth in the same tomb where Abner had been placed. Abner, who had also been unjustly murdered and buried with honor, even though he was in opposition to David. Abner and Ishbosheth, who had been basically co-rulers of Israel. David had Ishbosheth's head, this head that was supposed to represent the leadership and the title to Israel. He had it buried in the tomb where Abner was buried. As far as the placing the bodies of the murderers of David's son, of Saul's son rather, fingers got in the way. David had the bodies of the murderers of Saul's son Ishbosheth publicly displayed. Well, you see, they didn't have Twitter and Facebook, so the things that happened in David's camp weren't known unless they had a way of publicly posting it. So the way they posted things in those days was to hang them out by the pool for everybody to go by and go, oh my goodness, did you see the news on Facebook today? It was hanging out by the pool. And so they had the bodies by the pool in Hebron for everybody to go, oh, I wonder what the story behind that is. And I suspect there were self-appointed people within the community who placed themselves strategically by the pool, willing to share all the good information for a small fee, and you could get all the local gossip. So it was maybe even juicier than Facebook or any of these other news feeds that seem to spring up like leaves and weeds these days. So can't keep track of them all. Maybe you guys can, but there seemed to be a lot of them. What was the reason? Well, I think David wanted to, number one, send a clear message to the nation that just because Ishbosheth was now dead, Saul's family was off limits. This was not an open season to go around and now kill off all of Saul's clan or kill off all the Benjamites that were part of his tribe. This was not an invitation to go around and do them all in, because there's the evidence of what happens if you try. David was not going to have any part of it. And so this was probably pretty good evidence that you shouldn't try it, because unless maybe there were some empty hooks to remind them of what might happen if you tried it. And it was swift. I mean, he didn't waste any time. So by the time the news reached out that somebody was out there trying to do in Saul's extended family, there was evidence down by the pool that maybe you should disregard that temptation, because it didn't pay very well. So it's thought that the murderer's hands were cut off because that was the implement that did the evil deed, and the feet were cut off because that was what they used to try to convey the news back to David in hopes of a reward. So, and it might have had to do with, if your eye offends you, poke it out, if you're that kind of Old Testament justice. So if your feet do you a disservice, you cut them off. If your hand does you a disservice, you cut them off. So that might have been all part of that thinking. One other comment before I jump into my last observation about Ishbosheth's legacy. When you read the passage, it's a little odd that the telling of Ishbosheth's murder happens in like a two-part statement. I did a lot of looking around on that, and it's wise for us not to read anything into it. It's not like they stabbed him and then left and then came back and then did it a second time, or maybe let him bleed out and then came back and cut off his head. It was more of a literary thing where they sort of, the Old Testament's got places in it that are a little hard for us Westerners to read, is what it boils down to. The Old Testament tends to give you the bottom line, which if we can learn to read it, it's kind of nice for people like me who like the bottom line. Kind of give me the bottom line and then give me the details later, because that's basically what it is. It's kind of giving you the bottom line. They went in and killed him. Oh, you want the details? Well, they went in and killed him, and then they cut off his head and put it probably in a sack of grain so that people wouldn't notice that they were carrying his head around. And they escaped by way of the Jordan Valley and went down to where David was and tried to present him the kingdom. And that's basically, so it was a narrative tool. That's the way they talked. So it was kind of gave you the big line, he's dead. Oh, by the way, you want the details? Okay, well, here's the details. And we probably are wise not to read anything into it that they wrote it that way. Okay, well, that was helpful. Some observations about Ishbosheth. If he had not been appointed a puppet king by Abner, we might never have known of his existence, because up until this event, nobody really knew about him. So that's your first clue about him and his character. Secondly, he either went to the battle with his other three brothers and somehow escaped, which seems a little unlikely. But if he did escape, he also escaped with Abner, the general, which seems really weird. Abandoning Saul to die, by the way, which would be kind of odd, that you would leave your king and his best warrior, Jonathan, up there to leave undefended. Or if they were wounded, you certainly wouldn't stay with them until the end. But for some reason, Abner and Ishbosheth show up unscathed out of the war. Or somehow he avoided all the battle completely, in which case you have to wonder if there was cowardice for not showing up at the war. And the fact that Israel didn't trust him later on, I'm beginning to wonder if maybe there was cowardice, that he never showed up at all. How Abner escaped all that, being the general, well, Saul, I need to take care of some urgent business for this upcoming battle, and suddenly he wasn't there. That's a piece of scripture you always have to wonder about. Second thing about Ishbosheth is he didn't inspire loyalty, and his subjects didn't seem to trust him. They trusted Abner when Abner was kind of the power behind the throne, but once Abner's gone, Ishbosheth of his own doesn't seem to inspire any loyalty. Doesn't seem like he ever sired children, so family somehow didn't seem to be important to him, or that's certainly not an element in his life. In his treatment of David's wife, Michal, realize that was his sister. So this is Ishbosheth's sister, and yet in his dealings with her, because David demands that she be returned, you don't see any element of love in the dealings there. She's treated as a property of state and handed around like a state transaction, like something you would do as a political maneuver, and handed back as a political pawn with no personal interaction shown in any of the passage. He both feared and alienated Abner, his military commander, which your life depends on Abner and you having a good relationship, and yet you really just see this sort of a contractual relationship there in what's going on. And in turn, Abner used Ishbosheth much like a pawn. You don't really see any respect, any honoring of him like a king. You don't see love or respect really in either direction. One is the general, one is the son of Saul, and so be it. That's how they use each other. Left alone, Ishbosheth's self-worth seems to be so poor that he drew away from ruling Israel, so much so that Israel noticed and became afraid that they were not being ruled, and they were worried. The very captains that he once trusted enough to give access to his place of residence, that he could have turned to for leadership in Abner's absence, disdained him, and at their first opportunity they put him to death. People of his own tribe, the people that he should have trusted. They used subterfuge to put him to death while he slept in his own bed, either to benefit themselves, or maybe because they were afraid for Israel's future, or maybe for both, kind of killing two birds with one stone. Ishbosheth, as a king who's in trouble with others, was in the end too foolish to post a guard that he could trust, and so he was murdered in his sleep. And so ends the sorry tale of a man that without this sorry tale we'd probably never heard of. What an epitaph. Well, I think with that, we'll turn it over for our prayer time.
I've got on my list, I talked to Linda Rodman. Thank you, Nancy, for giving me that. But I talked to her this week and she just cracked 2 ribs. And Libby and I were talking, it seems like when there's a death in the family, the widow or the keeper of that person seems to get hurt, breaks a wrist, falls or something. It's just strange. We've noticed it with the people in our class even that have had other side effects after they lost their loved one. But keep praying for Linda. The doctor told her that she was doing what she was supposed to, so she's just in a little bit of pain. But other than that, she said she was healing. But Mark, her son, we've been praying for Mark too. He's been in the hospital for 7 weeks in Michigan. He's got a bad mass between his bladder and his spine. And what they're trying to do is shrink this. And so he's had radiation, but when they started him on chemo, they gave him too much again. This chemo's hard for your body. So he's gotten very weak. So they had to cut back on the chemo. Instead of him having 1 more time, he's going to have 2 more because they had to cut it in half. But his legs aren't working. Being in bed for 7 weeks. And he's a young man. He's not but, I think, 57. But
Child. A child.
Yeah. But they're going to let him go to rehab and see if they can get his energy back up before they start back on the chemo again. And I know Linda's torn, but he told her not to come. What's so sad, he was living in Colorado and had friends, and they transported him to Michigan for his job, and he hadn't met anybody till they found out he was sick. So it's really sort of, it's sad, it really is. But we pray for Linda and Mark Rodman. Pray for Madge's family. She lost her brother Friday, but we've been praying he'd go to heaven for a long time. He'd been really sick and all, so it was a blessing for Dan to go to the Lord. Her son messed up his elbow, and he was going, Madge's son Chris, and he went to the doctor in Columbia. It was supposed to be one of the best doctors to fix this, and when they tested him, he had COVID. So they told him they couldn't operate that morning. He had driven from Charleston to Columbia. So they're going to do it, what, in 2 weeks, Madge?
They're going to do it this Thursday.
This Thursday?
Thursday at 3:30.
Okay. 3:30 Thursday. Think about Chris he's got to wear a hard cast for 4 weeks and then a soft cast after that. He just tore a bunch of things in his elbow. It was just an unusual accident. My son gets his tube out Thursday. Just pray that that'll go smoothly, and he'll have some time, before he has to do another treatment or do things where he was so excited yesterday. He had snow at the beach. He sent me a picture. He had 2 leeches on his deck, and he thought it was wonderful. I told him I was glad he got it instead of us. But anyway, do pray for Kurt for Thursday. Carolyn said keep praying for Bobby to get his strength, Buddy, to get his strength back. Bobby Adams is having some kind of injections in his neck to make him feel better, but right now they haven't kicked in yet. And we noticed him at Jean's funeral Friday, he's having a hard time getting around. So do pray for Bobby and Alice and her losing her sister Jean. I finally found Toby's address, and I gave it to Faye, and I think she mailed it in. We want to bombard her with cards, but I haven't found out yet. She's in rehab, but I haven't found out yet exactly what it was or what they're doing for her. I can't get in touch with any family member to check on her. I finally just called Melody's business and got her address from one of her workers. So just keep praying for Toby. Pat Lewis had surgery on her neck. Keep praying for Pat. Richard Smith we prayed for. Ann Smith's son a couple weeks ago, he did have to have surgery on his knee from that fall. So keep praying for Richard. And we prayed a couple of weeks ago for Nancy O'Neill's nephew, Kyle. How's he doing, Nancy?
He's doing really well. It's a long process, the healing of an injury to your brain, but he's really doing well.
Oh, good. Well, I knew we'd been praying for him. And, and Pick Waters. I ran into Polly Friday, and she told me Pick can hear out of the side where the COVID plant is, but he can't hear out of the other side. So if you talk to him, you have to talk to him on that side. But that he's having injections, his neck too. He's having a lot of trouble with his neck. And she said he was in a good bit of pain. So remember Pick. All right, have anybody else?
I was coming back from a farm that I have yesterday over in Leslie, and I stopped at Food Lion to get 2 groceries, and a gentleman came up to me, asking me for money, and I told him I don't carry cash, and he said, I'm living with my wife and my son in a house that they turned off the electricity, and he had a kerosene can, like a plastic container. He said, would you be able to buy me some kerosene? So I said, sure, I'll buy you some kerosene. So, and then he said, would you be able to buy me some food? So I told him, sure, I'll buy you some food. So I took him over to the gas station. We filled up a can of kerosene. And then I took him across the street over to Bojangles. And he said, would you mind buying me a family-sized meal so it'll last a couple of days? And I said, certainly, I'll buy you that. So I bought that for him. And then I drove him, because he had walked all the way from his house, which is about 1.5 miles. He said, sir, I'll wash your car. You know what the weather was like yesterday.
Oh.
So I said to him, you don't need to wash my car. I said, that'd be way too cold. I wouldn't want to stand around waiting for him. But I said, don't worry about that at all. And so I drove him to his, it's not even a house, it's not even an apartment. It's a ramshackle place on Albright, on the 2nd floor. And he walked up the steps. He he's 61 years old, recently had a clot in his leg. He said he's a Christian. We talked about Christ. He has a son that's 15, and his wife's name is Barbara. His name is Larry Ellison. Kind of like the guy that owns Oracle, but it's not the same guy. But so I dropped him off there, and I said, do you want me to help carry up anything for you? And he said, no, I'll take care of it. He gave me his phone number, and I told him, I said, I'll talk to my church, because I deliver food on Saturdays, and I said, I know there are people that have needs, and I said, beside myself, I said, this person really has some needs. So, because apparently their heat is off, and so they're using a space heater or something that uses kerosene, which is not too safe anyway to begin with. So, but I told him, I said, yeah, I'll definitely do that. So, if you would pray for him and his family.
Does he work?
He said he's had a hard time working because he has a real bad hobble because of this blood clot in his leg. He has a blood clot. He said that it had started in his neck, and the doctors told him that he was fortunate that it missed his heart and went down to his leg.
Oh.
But sometimes you meet people that you know that kind of telling you a story. He doesn't qualify as that in my mind. So someone that's really in need. He said he dropped out of school. He said he was raised in Colombia, dropped out of school when he was in the 3rd grade, so he said he doesn't know how to read.
Oh.
So, but he seemed very willing to do work.
Anything, yeah, oh yeah.
So, but anyway, if you would pray for him, pray for someone that really has true needs. You know, there's a verse in the Bible that says if you see a brother without clothing or food and you say, be well, go in peace, what kind of faith is that? It's in James, verse in James. So I just thought that would be something for our church, because when we deliver food, I know I deliver food to people sometimes that really don't need food. Somehow they got on the list. But this guy, I think his family really needs food. I asked him if his wife worked, and he said she kind of does odd jobs here and there. I didn't get into a whole lot of detail with that. But, so if you would, just remember him in your prayers. And I'm going to talk to Chip and see if there's any way. I'll take the food over there.
Yeah, you know where they live, so that's great.
I do know where he lives, assuming he's still there, you know, within a week or two. But, I mean, I don't know what the protocol is, all that kind of stuff, as far as who we put on those lists, but to me, of all the people I've delivered food to, that person needs it more than any of the others.
Well, too, we need to remember to bring food out here. I noticed the last couple of weeks it's been empty.
Yeah.
And I thought one Sunday we just all need to go buy maybe $10 worth of groceries, because that doesn't go far now. But fill it up, you know, bring it in and fill it up. They need it. And with this cold weather, like you say, no heat, I can't imagine having no heat in this kind of weather. We're very fortunate.
Is
All
there
right, I've got
something
them
we could
down,
do?
Larry and Barbara.
Is there something we could do as a class though to help this family?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, again, in all these situations, I mean, I'll be honest, when I'm sitting there and someone says that, I'm kind of a little leery, because I've had a lot of people, I do not give money to people, but I will help people for needs.
Yeah.
I'll
Well, I
help
got
people-
scanned in the grocery store one day, and
Yeah.
when I found out I got it, I just walked up to her and I said, you should be ashamed of yourself, but I'm not going to ask for the money back.
Yeah.
But she gave a story and a half, but then I ran into her 3 days later, and she came up to me, I said, you've already scammed me once, I don't do twice.
Yeah.
So, but you have to be careful. I'm glad you followed through and found out.
Yeah, and if you give money, you don't know where that's going to go. But
Yeah.
food, you pretty much know where
But
that's
she
going.
didn't need it anyway. She
Yeah.
just was scanning people. I think that's how she was making the money for the week. And it was, you were embarrassed you got scanned, but yet you felt like the Lord probably needed you to hand that money anyway. Well, let us go to the Lord and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we have a long list today for you. We just appreciate it if you bring all of them up to your loving arms. Be with Linda and Mark. I just know it's hard for a mother to be here and her son be suffering so bad. And I just hope this mass shrinks so small that when they get in there, they'll be able to get every bit of it. And all of it will be gone. And then he can just do a few more things of chemo and do cancer relief. Be with my son Thursday as they take this tube out of his stomach and let it heal, where it's time for him to have another colonoscopy and see that it, hopefully, and pray that it's nothing there, that he can have a few months, a few years that he could just relax a little bit, not always have to keep going to doctors and having procedures. Thank you that Kyle's doing well. We just hope he just keeps recovering. Be with Pick and Polly. I know it's hard to be a caregiver. Be with Manny and Madge this week as her brother's funeral Tuesday afternoon, and be with Chris Thursday as he has his elbow operated on, and let them be able to completely fix it, and it'd be okay later. We would just like to be with Buddy Galt, be with Bobby. Both of them are suffering with their neck and back pain at these shops of work. Be with Alice losing her sister Jean. Be with this class losing Betty Jean Findale, such a godly, wonderful lady that lived to the fullness, that show your love to everybody else. Be with us in the following week. Be with this Larry and Barbara. Maybe the church can help them, and even our class will be to help. It's just so hard when things like that happen, and it seems like the more that happens, it just gets worse and worse. So just put your loving arms around them and let us show our love that we have for you to them. Thank you for this day. Be with every family here, and be with them next week, and let them all show your love to everyone else. For Christ's sake I pray. Amen.
Your name.